Right, thanking and praising God for the opportunities he gives us to actually get better. But that begs the question whether or not we actually want to get better. Because this chapter, John chapter 5, is going to start out with a famous healing with that question woven into it. The healing at the pool of Bethesda. And so let's just call this chapter better, because the healing at the pool of Bethesda is going to seem to relate to the final conversation with those opposing Jesus in Jerusalem this time, the conversation that takes us through the end of the chapter. But first, the first 14 verses are going to talk about that healing of the man by the pool of Bethesda who had been, as this verse 5 is going to describe it, an invalid for 38 years, as the ESV translates it. However, understanding that 38 years, just for me on a spiritual level, just sounds like an awfully long time to struggle, reminding me to reflect on my difficulties and how much more difficult many have it. Understanding that, though, Jesus, in approaching this man to heal him in verse 6, is going to ask him, as we mentioned, do you want to be healed? Which seems to be kind of an obvious question. But of course, if Jesus is asking it, he has more insight into the situation than we do. The man is going to bypass the question, probably assuming that at least on some level, of course he wants to be healed. But he is going to go on and tell Jesus his predicament, which is the healing that can take place at the pool, even without Jesus being there, is something he misses out on because of his condition, preventing him from being able to get in the waters when they are stirred by what some translations will say is an angel who gives a brief opportunity for healing in the stirred waters. But this man's predicament is he is not even able or ambulatory, I guess, enough to get in the waters before the healing opportunity has passed. But he's got a better chance here now that Jesus is with him. But there's another dilemma that Jesus is going to identify in verse 14. After he has healed him and circles back to see the man again, he is going to say, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. And we want to circle back to that point at the end of the chapter, because after the healing, verses 15 through 18 are going to describe why Jesus' ops are so frustrated with him, or his ops meaning his opposition, why they're so frustrated. First, it's going to say in verse 16, it's because he is healing on the Sabbath, that famous point of contention that we've seen in pretty much all the Gospels up to this point. But in addition, John is going to identify in verse 18, they are upset because he is calling God his Father, provoking the conversation throughout the rest of the chapter from verses 19 through about 29, where he is going to talk in detail about the fact that even if he's calling God his Father, he's not acting on his own authority. God is the one who is giving him the authority to do these things. And these deeds are actually, in verses 30 through the end of the chapter, going to be the evidence that he's not acting on his own authority, because if he was, God wouldn't be blessing the things that he is doing. But taking it more slowly, verses 19 through 29, going to show him literally saying, let's just read verse 19. So Jesus said to them, truly, truly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. Talking about the witness that he has had of the Father. It's almost like father like son. A good father demonstrates the kinds of things he would want a good son to live out. And that seems to be what Jesus is saying here. He didn't make this up. He is doing the kinds of things he has literally witnessed God doing. But that section we mentioned is going to break down even further in verses 25 through 29, where in addition to saying that the Father has given him an example, he's going to say that the Father has given him authority to execute judgment in verse 27. And that judgment is going to break down in a familiar category, verses 28 and 29, saying simply, as we saw in Matthew 25, a separation of the sheep and the goats. Quite simply, a resurrection to life of those who have done good, but a resurrection to judgment of those who have done evil. Going on in verses 30 through the end of the chapter, not only is he going to talk about the way that he is demonstrating or living out the things that he witnessed from his Father's example, he is going to go into more detail to talk about the witnesses to his work, saying that yes, he has not been ashamed to say that he is the Christ. But even beyond that, they had one who came before the Christ to bear witness of him. That is John in verse 33. But he's going to say his testimony is even greater. His witness is greater than just John's alone because of verse 36, the works that God is basically using to endorse the things that Christ is saying, the things that he is doing. He's literally going to say that the witness comes from God or his Father in verse 37, as additional evidence from God comes from the scriptures, meaning since they study the scriptures, they should be able to see in the scriptures that he is basically checking the boxes, for lack of a better term, of the things that the prophets told them to look for in the Christ. However, they don't see it because in verse 39, he's going to make the famous statement, you search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. The Christ is going to say about himself. Before closing out the chapter in verse 6 by saying, for if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? Reminding me of at least two things. One, the point we said we would circle back to from the healing at the pool of Bethesda, where Jesus asked the man, do you want to be healed? What we said seemed like an obvious answer, understanding the man's condition. However, God's insight, or Jesus' insight into the man's condition, seems to be clear in verse 14 after he healed him, where, as we said before, he said, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you, reminding me in life of times when not only have I been the person, but I have gotten a chance to see in benevolence work the need for us all to answer the question whether or not, when we are in a difficult situation in need of help, whether or not we actually want to get better, or whether or not we simply want our bad habits to pay better, or simply flat out produce better results. The distinction being, I can, as the old saying goes, I can give a person a fish and feed them for a day, or I can teach them to fish and feed them for a lifetime. That is sometimes a saying that is used to be dismissive of the need to help people who are in need, but it actually goes to the wisdom in how to help people appropriately, as opposed to having an excuse for simply being dismissive of those in a difficult circumstance. But understand the wisdom in that, and what Jesus is asking this man is understanding that if God makes his physical condition whole, there are some behaviors that might take him not only back into that condition, but, as Jesus says, into a worse circumstance. Thus his question at the outset, do you really want to get better? Meaning, beyond your current condition, do you really want to make the changes that are related to your condition's root causes? Reminding me of, as we said, his final conversation at the end of the chapter with those opposing him in Israel, who, or about whom he observed, as we mentioned in verse 39, the way that they search the scriptures because they think that in them they have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about him. Understanding that they were looking for the scriptures to, as we have seen throughout Israel's history, validate what they already believed, helping us to understand that, similar to the question that Jesus posed at the beginning of the chapter to the man at the pool of Bethesda, do you want to get better? It's the same question that seems to be relevant to Jesus' opposition at the end of the chapter. Do you really want to understand what the scriptures are saying? Or do you simply want the scriptures to add credibility to opinions that honestly aren't completely true? Something that today we sometimes call proof texting. Reminding me of what it was like to try to ride a bike without training wheels for the first time. I was, for lack of a better term, addicted to the training wheels because I loved the feeling of riding a bike, so much so that I never wanted to take the training wheels off. And that seems to be what is happening with Jesus' opposition in Jerusalem at this time. They want him to add training wheels to their opinions so that they always seem to make sense. But Jesus seems to be making it clear that God is not interested in propping up their opinions in a situation where they are perfectly capable of understanding the truth. In a chapter that even today begs the question whether or not we want God to genuinely change us in ways that improve the root causes of our problems, or whether we simply want him to prop us up in opinions and ways that, quite honestly, are just lacking.